He almost walked past her. The snow had been coming down since mid-morning, and by the time Hank Rourke reached the lower trail, it was already knee-deep in the hollows, and the light was the flat, directionless gray that means a mountain storm is settling in rather than passing through. He had his head down against the wind and his mind on the cattle he needed to get to the upper shelter before dark. And the shape in the snow at the base of the pine tree did not register as a person at first. It registered as a fallen branch, a shadow. Something the storm had put there that he would need to step around. He stepped around it. He had gone 3 paces when something made him stop. Not a sound, not a movement. Something that was not quite either of those things. A quality in the shape that was wrong for a branch, wrong for a shadow, wrong for anything the mountain usually left beside its trails. He turned back. She was on her side in the snow with her coat pulled up as far as it would go and her knees drawn toward her chest and her lips the color of the sky. She was very large with child. She was breathing, barely, with the shallow, labored rhythm of someone whose body is conserving everything it has left for the one function it will not surrender. He dropped to his knees beside her, and the cattle were already gone from his mind. If something in you just stopped, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Because what Hank Rourke does in the next 10 minutes, alone on a mountain trail in a Montana blizzard, is the reason Eliza Marsh is alive to tell it. And what he says when she wakes up will change the way you think about what it means to find someone. She had been walking since dawn. This was what she told him later, in pieces, over the days when she was strong enough to tell anything. That she had left the Bitterroot Crossing boarding house before light with her trunk and her coat and $32 she had been saving since August, intending to reach the stage road before the storm closed it. That she had misjudged both the distance and the weather. That she had been on the mountain trail for 6 hours when her legs stopped working properly, not from cold alone, though the cold was considerable, but from something that had been building since the previous afternoon and that she had been refusing to acknowledge because acknowledgement would have required her to stop. And stopping alone on a mountain, with no shelter and no one who knew where she was the option she had decided she could not afford. What had been building since the previous afternoon was the beginning of labor. She was 30 years old and full-figured even before the pregnancy. Broad-shouldered, substantial, the kind of woman who occupied her full share of space and had never needed an apology for it. She had come to Bitterroot Crossing in May from Missoula, where she had spent 2 years keeping the accounts for a dry goods operation owned by a man named Garrett Wells, who was 44 years old and married, and who had told her, in the pas un particular persuasive way of men who have decided they are entitled to something, that his domestic situation was a formality he had every intention of resolving. She had believed him for longer than she should have, which was the fact she had the hardest time forgiving herself for. Not the loving, not the trusting, but the believing when the evidence had been telling her something different for months. When the evidence became impossible to ignore, she had left Missoula with everything she could carry. Garrett Wells had not followed her, which told her everything about the resolution he had every intention of making. She had arrived in Bitterroot Crossing in May and had found work keeping the books at the general store and had rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Pell, who had asked no questions and had received, in exchange, no answers. The Bitterroot Crossing boarding house had its own social architecture, as all small frontier communities do. And within that architecture, Eliza's situation had been located and cataloged within a week of her arrival. She was unmarried. She was visibly with child. She had no husband and no story that accounted for his absence in any way the community found satisfactory. The women who set the social temperature of Bitterroot Crossing had assessed her with the efficiency of long practice and had arrived at a verdict that was not spoken aloud but was present in every interaction she had. At the store, at the water pump, in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, when she passed the other residents going to and from their rooms. She had kept walking. She had learned in 30 years that the only response to a verdict rendered without evidence was to keep moving through it, to do her work, pay her accounts, hold her back straight, and refuse to give anyone the satisfaction of watching it land. What had ended the arrangement in Bitterroot Crossing was not the verdict, but a letter. The letter arrived in October and was from Garrett Wells. And it informed her, in the language of a man who had decided legal precision was his best protection, that he had no knowledge of any child, that any claim she might make against him would be vigorously contested, and that she should not expect any further communication on the subject. She had read the letter twice. Then she had set it in the stove and watched it burn, which was the most satisfying thing she had done in months. By November, it was clear that Mrs. Pell's arrangement would not survive the birth. Not because Mrs. Pell was unkind, but because Mrs. Pell had other boarders and a reputation to consider and had told Eliza, apologetically but plainly, that she would need to make other arrangements by the new year. Eliza had understood. She had begun planning for the stage road. She had planned badly. The storm had moved faster than the seasonal average. The labor had started earlier than she had calculated, and she had been walking on the wrong trail for 2 hours before she understood she was on the wrong trail, by which point her body had made a decision that superseded the question of which trail she was on. Hank Rourke found her at 4 in the afternoon, in the snow at the base of a pine tree, 8 miles from the nearest town and 3 miles from his ranch house. And the storm was getting worse. He had been a field medic in the Army for 4 years, which was the fact about himself he had shared with the fewest people and which he had thought about the least since leaving the service in 1872. He had come to the Bitterroot Valley because it was as far from anything that reminded him of those 4 years as he could get without leaving the country. And he had spent 7 years successfully not thinking about what he had learned in them. What he had learned came back with complete and unsentimental precision the moment he understood what was happening. He did not carry her. Carrying was not the correct procedure, and he knew it. Movement of a certain kind during active labor creates risks that stillness does not. What he did was get his coat around her and get her partially upright against the pine tree and assess, quickly and thoroughly, what he was working with. What he was working with was a woman in advanced labor, 8 miles from a doctor in a blizzard, with approximately 2 hours of usable light. "I need you to hear me," he said. His voice had gone to the register he had not used in 7 years. The register that was not warm and was not cold, but was absolutely clear. The voice of a man who has learned to give instructions in situations where the instructions are the difference between outcomes. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. Dark, direct. The eyes of a woman who was in considerable pain and was not going to make it easier on either of them by pretending otherwise. "I hear you," she said. "I'm going to get you to my ranch house. I need you to tell me if anything changes, anything at all. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said. "How far?" 3 miles. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. "All right," she said. He got her to the ranch house in 40 minutes, which was not a record he had intended to set, but which he would later understand had been the most important 40 minutes of both their lives. He did not leave her to get the horse. He did not have 40 minutes to spare in that direction, and he knew it. He supported her weight, and she gave him what she had, and the blizzard covered them both equally, without regard for the circumstances. which was something he had always found to be one of the mountain's more honest qualities. He got her inside, got the fire built up, got water heating, got his hands clean, and delivered the child himself at 6:30 in the evening with the wind loud against the north wall. And the snow coming so thick past the window, it looked solid. The child was a girl. She came into the world with the vigorous, unambiguous announcement of someone who had been traveling a long time and was relieved to arrive. And Hank Rourke, who had assisted in 17 field deliveries over 4 years and had not expected to assist in an 18th, set the child carefully on her mother's chest and felt something that had been very tight in him for a long time loosened by 1 degree. Eliza looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "You've done this before," she said. "Once or twice," he said. She looked back at the child. "Thank you," she said. It was the simplest sentence available and contained everything. He said, "I'll make something hot. Sleep if you can." He went to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment with his hands on the counter and breathed, which was something he had always needed to do after a delivery. A private moment of acknowledging what had just occurred before the practical requirements of what came next asserted themselves. The child was healthy. The mother was alive. The storm was not letting up. There were practical requirements. She stayed because the storm stayed. The storm stayed for 4 days, which was the kind of storm that the Bitterroot Valley produced once or twice each winter, and which local residents recognized as the mountain asserting its indifference to human scheduling. Hank had supplies for the duration. He had always kept sufficient stores, a habit of the man alone who understands that the difference between prepared and unprepared on a mountain in winter is the difference between conditions that are difficult and conditions that are fatal. He brought her soup on the first day. She was sitting up, which he noted as a good sign. The child was sleeping against her in the particular boneless repose of the newly arrived, which he recognized as another good sign. She told him her name. He told her his. These seemed like sufficient introductions under the circumstances. On the second day, he brought her books from the shelf by the fireplace, because she had been looking at the shelf since the previous afternoon with the expression of a person who wanted to read and had not yet decided whether asking was appropriate. He brought her 3 without commenting on them, and she said thank you, and he went back to his work, which was the work of a man whose ranch was entirely his own responsibility and which did not stop for storms. On the 3rd day, she asked him what he wanted her to do. Not what he wanted her to feel or to promise, but what practically she could do to be useful, to justify the space she was taking up, to account for the soup and the firewood and the use of his bed, which he had given her without discussion and had been sleeping in the main room himself without mentioning it. He had been thinking about this, not in the way of a man calculating a transaction, but in the way of a man who runs a large property alone and who has just had evidence, in the most direct possible form, that a loan has a specific cost that he had been paying without fully accounting for it. "Can you keep books?" he said. She looked at him. "I kept the accounts for a general store for 6 months," she said. "Before that, I kept the books for a dry goods operation in Missoula for 2 years." "The ranch accounts are a mess," he said. "I don't have time for the accounts." "I have time for the accounts," she said. He nodded. "When you're able." She started the accounts on the 4th day, which was the day the storm broke, propped up in the bed with the child asleep beside her, and the ledgers he brought her spread across the blanket. He came in at midday to check the fire and found her 3 months behind in the records and moving with a speed and precision that suggested the 6 months at the general store had been a considerable understatement of her capacities. He said nothing about it. He added wood to the fire and went back outside. What he was thinking, on the ride to check the upper shelter that afternoon, was this: that she needed a place, and the place needed her. And that the particular way she had said, "I have time for the accounts," not "I will," not "I suppose I could, but I have time," as a plain statement of available resource, told him that she understood the terms he was offering, and was prepared to meet them on those terms and no others. He was thinking that this was a woman who had been through something that would have flattened most people, and who had come out of it on the other side still entirely herself. He was thinking that entirely herself was not a small thing to be. On the 5th day, when the road was passable and she could, in principle, have gone, she did not go. She was at the kitchen table with the accounts when he came in from the morning work. And she looked up when he came in and looked back down at the ledger. And that was the whole of the conversation. And it was sufficient. She had been at the ranch for 11 days when the man came. He arrived on a Tuesday, on a rented horse from Bitterroot Crossing, in the particular way of a man who has decided something needs to be handled and has prepared himself for the handling of it. His name was Dawes, not Garrett Wells himself, but a man who worked for Garrett Wells' family's legal interests in the territory, a function that required a certain capacity for unpleasant tasks and that Dawes appeared to have developed without apparent discomfort. He knocked. Hank opened the door. Dawes had a document. The document described, in legal language, the position of Garrett Wells with respect to any child that might have been born to a woman named Eliza Marsh. The position being that Mr. Wells acknowledged no paternity, no obligation, and no claim, but wished to make clear, through the attached affidavit, that the character of the woman in question was such that the circumstances of the child's origin were batsage or at best uncertain. The affidavit used the word worthless once, and the phrase of no moral standing twice. Hank read it through. He read it the way he read ledgers and supply lists, completely, without expression, taking in all of it. Then he looked at Dawes. "You rode up here in February to give me this," he said. "Mr. Wells wanted to ensure—" "What does Mr. Wells want?" Hank said. Dawes reorganized himself slightly. "Mr. Wells has become aware that the woman has taken up residence here. He wants to make clear that She's not taking up residence here," Hank said. "She lives here. She keeps my accounts." He paused. "She's also going to be my wife, which I hadn't gotten around to asking her yet. So I'd be grateful if you'd give me until this afternoon before you go telling anyone in town." Dawes looked at the document in his hand. "Tell Mr. Wells," Hank said, in the same flat, carrying tone, "that the document can go back with you. And tell him that the next time he sends someone up this mountain on his business, I'll be coming down on mine." He closed the door. Eliza was at the kitchen table. She had heard. The door between the kitchen and the front room was, as it had been on every morning since she arrived, open. He came in. He stood at the counter and looked at the floor for a moment. Not in embarrassment, but in the manner of a man who had just said something without preparation that he intended to stand behind and was taking a moment to verify that he did, in fact, intend to stand behind it. He looked at her. "I meant that," he said. "If you're willing." She had kept her face still through the whole of it, through Dawes's voice and the legal language and the word worthless that she had heard through the open door, that she had heard before and had learned not to let lodge where it could do damage. She had kept it still the way she had kept it still in the boarding house and in Missoula and in every room that had rendered its verdict before she opened her mouth. She looked at him, at this man who had turned back on a mountain trail in a blizzard, who had delivered her daughter in a ranch house kitchen, who had just told a lawyer she was his wife before he had asked her, and who was now standing at the counter asking whether she was willing, as though the answer were genuinely in question. "I'm willing," she said. The child made the sound she made, a small, complete sound of someone asserting continued presence. And Eliza looked at her daughter and then back at Hank. "She needs a name," Eliza said. "I've been waiting." "What have you been thinking?" he said. "Clara," she said, "for the clear days, after a storm." He looked at the child, at the window, where the winter light was coming in clean and flat and honest. The way light comes in after a blizzard has said what it had to say and moved on. "Clara," he said. The spring came into the Bitterroot Valley the way it always came, reluctantly at first, then decisively. The snow line retreating up the mountain by inches and then by feet, and then gone from the lower slopes entirely by the end of April. The ranch was different in spring than it had been in the winter, not because the work changed, but because the quality of the mornings changed. The light coming earlier, the sounds outside expanding from the narrow winter vocabulary of wind and snow to something larger and more various. Birds and water, and the particular creak of a house that is warming up after months of defending itself against the cold. Eliza was at the kitchen table with the accounts when Hank came in from the morning check, and she had been at the kitchen table with the accounts most mornings since February. And this had stopped being notable and had become simply the condition of things. The way the accounts were kept, and the way the mornings began, and the way the house ran. She had kept the books, and she had kept the house, and she had kept Clara, and she had, quietly, without announcement, restructured the ranch's provision schedule in a way that had reduced the monthly outlay by $11, which she had noted in the ledger and not mentioned until he found it himself. Which he had, and about which he had said nothing, except to look at the number and then at her for a moment with an expression that she had learned meant he was satisfied. The account with Bitterroot Crossing had been renegotiated. Not by Eliza and not by Hank individually, but by the combined effect of a ranch that was running noticeably better than it had been, and a man who had told Dawes what he thought of Garrett Wells's affidavit in terms that Dawes had apparently found sufficiently clear to repeat accurately to several people on his way back through town. What the town had heard, that Hank Rourke had found a woman dying in the snow, and had brought her home and delivered her child and married her, and that the man who had left her in that position had sent a lawyer up the mountain and been sent back down it. What the town had decided over the winter was its own business. What it had decided by spring was different. Not everyone had changed their opinion. Some people required more time. Some required the particular evidence of a well-run ranch and a healthy child, and a woman who came into Bitterroot Crossing for supplies every 2 weeks, with her back straight and her accounts in order, and did not ask anyone's permission to be there. That evidence accumulated, the way evidence accumulates, over months. Vera Pell, the widow whose boarding house Eliza had left in February, came to call in May, on a Tuesday afternoon, on a social visit that required no particular justification, because it was the kind of call that women made on other women in the valley, and always had. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at the accounts spread on one end of the table and at Clara in the basket by the stove and at the general state of the kitchen, which was the state of a kitchen that was properly managed, and said, "You've done well." "I've had help," Eliza said. "More than most," Mrs. Pell agreed. She looked at her coffee. "The Wells man left the territory, did you hear?" "I heard," Eliza said. "Business difficulties," Mrs. Pell said, in the neutral tone of a woman who knew more than she was saying and had decided the knowing was sufficient. Eliza said nothing. She looked at Clara, who was awake and examining her own fist with the absolute concentration of a 4-month-old engaged in the most important research of her life. "She has your eyes," Mrs. Pell said. "She does," Eliza said. Hank came in at midday, not because he usually came in at midday, but because the morning work had finished early and the kitchen was close to where he was, and the smell coming from it was the smell of coffee and something baking. And he had long since stopped pretending that he did not plan his morning route to pass by the kitchen window. He nodded to Mrs. Pell, poured his coffee, and sat at the far end of the table with his accounts question. Mrs. Pell looked at the two of them at either end of the table, with the kitchen between them and Clara between them, and the ledgers and the coffee cups, and the small daily business of a house that was being run by two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and had made of those circumstances something permanent. She finished her coffee. She stood to leave. At the door, she turned back and looked at Eliza. At this woman she had asked to make other arrangements and who had walked out into a February blizzard and had come back in the spring as someone entirely different in the eyes of the valley, though not in her own. "I should have found a way to keep you," Mrs. Pell said. "You did what you could," Eliza said. "It wasn't enough." Eliza looked at her steadily. "It brought me to the right trail," she said. Mrs. Pell went out. Hank looked at his coffee. Outside the window, the spring was doing what it did. Enormous, patient, entirely indifferent to human arrangements, going about the business of green and warmth and new growth the way it had for 10,000 years and would for 10,000 more. The creek was running high. The south slope was clear. Somewhere on the upper trail, the snow was retreating another inch. She had been dying in the snow. She had been found. She had been brought in from the cold into a house that needed her the way she needed it. And she had made of that house something worth the finding. That was the whole of the accounting. She had always been worth the finding. She made the reckoning with both hands, her whole self in it, taking up every inch of the life that had been given back to her on a mountain trail in February. And she did not ask permission for any of it, because she had stopped asking permission for things that were already entirely hers.